Hi, this is Seth Coutinho, and you're listening to Catholic versus Catholic.
If you would, just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you believe, and how you came to believe it.
Sure. Well, I am a cradle Catholic. I was born and raised Catholic, so I'm not a sedevacanist or anything like that. There hasn't really been any moments where I abandoned the faith or seriously considered any other faith, I would say. So it's just been a slow process of coming to fully embrace for myself what my parents raised me with. I am the second oldest of 6 kids, and I was homeschooled along with my other siblings up until high school. So we were very close-knit, and my parents took the faith very seriously. We were also involved with a kind of a local group of Catholic homeschool families, which was really great. It was kind of a blessing and a curse. I mean, a blessing because we had this great support system, but kind of a curse just because that, coupled with being homeschooled, I guess, lived in an echo chamber of sorts, which I didn't experience people of other faith really until high school, and that was where I had to start studying, the reasons behind our faith.
Among all the good examples around you, is there one that stands out in your memory as someone that really exuded faith? Is there someone that stands out for you?
Yeah, there is actually. There's a priest, Father Adam, that I had, a very young, very passionate priest who was just, fresh out of seminary, and I went to him for confession a lot. He helped me through a lot of things that I struggled with when I was a kid with confession, because confession was something I really struggled with when I was younger.
What ages would you have been during that period?
It would have been around like 10 years old, maybe 10 to 13, around there. It wasn't even like it was like mortal sin necessarily. It was just various things that I guess I was embarrassed about or like felt ashamed about, and I wouldn't confess a sin, and it wasn't necessarily a mortal sin, but I was just too embarrassed to tell the priest that for whatever reason. I don't know if it was because I was afraid, oh, he's going to judge me or he's going to tell someone, or if it was more like, I don't think God will forgive me for this. It's kind of like I'm so far removed from that, like in terms of years, that it's hard to really know what it was. I mean, I felt every time I did that, like there was some guilt, like, why am I not confessing this? I need to be doing it. Like, I knew what I was supposed to be doing. I knew that intentionally holding back a sin invalidates the entire confession. So the guilt was, I guess, building up, and then I finally, just told my parents, like, hey, like, this is what's been going on. What do I do? And all they really did is encourage me, like, hey, let's go to confession, tell them everything, and then that's it.
Did you feel good when you did it?
Oh, I felt amazing, yeah.
I do want to put sort of a caveat or a warning onto this sort of notion of the feeling that you get. Can you talk just a little bit about the truth as something that goes beyond feeling? There may be feelings attached from time to time, but it's not necessary. There's not a necessary connection. You don't need to feel a burning desire for the Eucharist, or you don't need to feel the presence of Jesus. You don't need to feel affection for Jesus when you're partaking of the Eucharist, but you need to believe. So I think that distinction is very important. Can you talk about that from your own personal experience, particularly as you've evolved from a very young person to a mature adult? There must have been some evolution in how you've understood that difference, right?
Right, yeah. I mean, it's very much a balance between truth and emotion. Going only on emotion is, why we have so many, the Mormons. I mean, a lot of what they do is purely emotion, and it's in contradiction with what the truth is. So, but with that said, I mean, God gave us emotions for a reason. They're supposed to be something that reinforces our faith, lets us know that it's true when everything else is aligned. For me personally, coming to learn the truth of confession, learning what exactly it means, seeing how it's portrayed in Scripture, the early church fathers, knowing that it's true whether I feel it or not, helps me in those times when maybe I don't feel it, but I know that my sins have been forgiven. I know that it's true even if I don't feel it.
Can you talk a little bit from your own experience? What does it mean to be dry? Can you talk about dryness in prayer?
It's kind of when you know you're doing everything right, I guess. You're setting aside time for the day to do that. You're trying to center yourself, clear your thoughts, but you don't feel God's presence. It's kind of hard to explain, but you don't feel how you normally feel when you're praying, and you almost feel a sense of discouragement. You feel God is distant, and then from that, I mean, the evil one can work anything through that, either from, oh yeah, see, God was never real to begin with, or oh, he doesn't love you anymore, or whatever that may be. And the secret with that is just to persevere, because eventually it'll come out, and you'll through that experience, you'll be closer to God because of it.
And how old are you?
I'm 23.
I'm just wondering about your vocation. Are you called to marriage? Are you called to anything in particular? Can you talk about vocation?
Well, that's something I'm very much figuring out at the moment. That's a constant discernment that I haven't really received a confident pull one way or the other. So as of right now, it's living out the best I can as a single person, being open at the very least to whatever I'm called to.
Do you have peer pressure from family and friends saying, hey, you'd make a great priest or something like that? Or, hey, I've got some young Catholic girls lined up that you could marry? Or is there any sort of peer pressure, good or bad?
No, I wouldn't say that there's a whole lot of pressure. And in college, being part of a really strong Catholic community, I think I have the support system and like people around me totally get like the idea of discernment and being called to one way or the other.
So you reached out to me actually on Facebook because you'd listened to my atheist experience call-in, right?
Yeah, yes.
So what is it with the atheist experience that drew your attention? Because that's kind of odd considering that you never were an atheist.
I mean, I've never been an atheist, but I've been through periods where with the rise of, atheism in colleges and just in the weird millennial age range of high school to college where people are very skeptical, I've just become very familiar with the arguments, and I've been trying to learn how to respond to them. I mean, I'm always watching, atheist Christian debates or whatever, just to kind of learn, what's effective, what's not. So yeah, I remember coming across your discussion, and I just really enjoyed it. I thought you did a great job. I think that show a lot of times has callers in who are Christian who just don't know what they're talking about and just make us look bad, I guess. But listening to you is like, I can tell you have a great handle of philosophy and how to, have an argument.
I feel like I was a little bit smug and arrogant and I didn't like my attitude too much. So I'm not too proud of the way I dealt with these people. So I apologize for that.
Sure, but in fairness, they themselves have very aggressive personalities. You kind of need to be a little aggressive in order to get anywhere with them.
I don't think my approach is very effective, certainly for converting people, but I am interested in philosophy and I like playing with ideas and I'm looking for the best arguments that the atheists have. I don't see any good arguments yet, but I'm still hoping to find a good argument for atheism. But what is your experience in terms of the best arguments that we can give as monotheists or as Catholics in particular? And what is an example of the best arguments on their side?
I would say, interestingly enough, the best argument for both sides are actually kind of linked together. I think the strongest argument for theism is the argument from objective morality, which is there is objective morality, which most people agree to. So where does it come from if not God? Because there's no other way to base it off anything. It can't be based off science. It has to be based off something outside of ourselves. But on the other end, I think probably the strongest argument the atheists have is the problem of evil, problem of suffering, which links into that. If morality is objective, why does God allow it to be violated so often? But to be perfectly honest, I'm really bad at engaging people. I'm not a very confrontational person. I'm not one who will go out and preach to the streets why Catholicism is true or interrupting, some pro-choice rally or something. It's nothing like that. I guess the biggest for me has been my Protestant friends, whom I have a few, not a whole lot. But it's been interesting. I mean, there's so many things we disagree on. And with that, it's been just a lot of studying, trying to understand their point of view, understanding, is this scriptural, is this historical? Most of the time it's not. How do I engage them on this? How do I show them this in the most charitable way possible? So yeah, I mean, a lot of the time I spend is listening to podcasts or debates or whatever it may be on the issues of, Catholic versus Protestant or atheistic debates, although I haven't had many conversations with atheists other than the debates I have on the internet, which normally aren't very productive. Another thing I really have been, at least in the last few years, have just been the arguments for and against abortion and how to argue that effectively. And the arguments that I find most effective are actually ones that don't appeal at all to religion. They just appeal to science and philosophy. So that's something I'm also very passionate about. I mean, the basic thing I always start out with is the scientific consensus that life begins at conception. And then from there you can say all humans deserve the right to life. And in order for them to disprove that, they would have to give an example other than abortion where a human does not possess the right to life.
Well, that's easy. Old people.
Old people?
Did you not know that in my country, Canada, we're allowed to kill old people now?
Oh, wow, yeah, euthanasia.
But what do you think about this idea of verses? Because a lot of people get touchy. They don't like the idea of pitting one faith against another. From my perspective, I think that the truth is good, and that if we disagree about something, we can't both be right. So we can talk about it and approach the truth together. This is sort of a Socratic approach to discovering the truth. I'm very, very excited about it. So I think verses is a ladder. I think that examining what separates us is a ladder to coming together in peace and unity and ultimately in God.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think personally it's a great idea. I think people get weary around verses thinking it's going to be an all-out brawl where you two hate each other at the end, or religions are even more divided. But I think in its purest form, having a discussion between two faiths should only lead to good. And I think the way you've done it especially has been good. I mean, from the few episodes I've listened to, it's been charitable. It's been more of a conversation than a debate, but one where you're still challenging people on their points if they say something that you find to be incorrect.
Can you talk about unity in general and the Orthodox in particular?
Sure. I think with unity, there's extremes on both ends. There's one where, we're all the same. We just have these slight disagreements. We're basically the same. There's nothing to do about it, which obviously is not true. And then there's the other extreme. Oh, we're so different. We cannot possibly have anything to do with each other. We can't associate with each other. We can't use, the same label as Christian with each other. One of us has to be Christian and one of us, isn't. So it's somewhere in the middle is the truth, obviously. So I would say at least with like my Protestant friends, I've definitely felt with them, obviously a mutual respect. And I think the whole idea of openness and acceptance, which has been, common to an extreme, obviously at this point, but has been something with my generation that has helped with this because, for instance, I have a Protestant friend who we've had great discussions. We respect each other. We respect each other's views, even though we disagree. But if you look at, his parents and his church, there might be a little more hostility towards me, and I might not be as open to discussion, or at least to the extent he is. So for me, unity is just about finding that balance between we have these agreements, but we also have these disagreements, and these are important disagreements that we should at least discuss, even if we're not going to change each other's minds. It's important to understand where each other are coming from. As far as Eastern Orthodox, from what I do know of the Orthodox Church is that it's so close to being Catholic other than submitting to the Pope, essentially. And then any of the dogmas that have developed since the 11th century, they might not have total agreement on it because of that.
When I converted to Christianity, Mary and the saints, more than Jesus Christ, drew me to Christianity. I'd like your perspective on that because you're a cradle Catholic. What is your perspective on Mary, and why do people shy away from Mary? I don't understand that. The Muslims love Mary, the Muslims revere Mary, and the Muslims will come into the church through Mary. The Muslims that do come in will come in through Mary. And the whole connection with Fatima, I just watched a video yesterday by my new friend and patron Scott Smith, who talked a lot about this idea of the Muslims coming in through Mary. So what is your perspective on Mary? What is it about Mary for you from your perspective?
Sure. Well, I grew up in a household that didn't shy away from devotion to Mary. I think what you're saying is really cool that you say that Mary was what brought you into the church. I think saying something like that to a Protestant would be very blasphemous because they don't quite understand what you mean by that. They might say, oh, so Mary, by her own strength, brought you in spite of what Jesus wanted, or, whatever they might bring up. And, obviously it's important to realize it is Mary working with Jesus to do that. So I could totally see where people would come from, how a Protestant would hear, like, the Hail Holy Queen that we pray after the Rosary, why they would say that doesn't make any sense to you, that's blasphemous. There's only one mediator between God and man, it's Jesus.
Mary, our life, our sweetness, and our hope.
Yeah, exactly.
Who are the saints that you call on the most and that you love the most?
Well, for my confirmation, I chose St. Pope Pius X. Something about his life and the miracles he performed before and after death just really appealed to me. And then kind of in hindsight, in recent years, I've come to appreciate the work he did, because he was before Vatican II. And how he really stood against modernism, or like modern or like liberal thinking can lead to heresy very easily, and how he stood against that. And it's unfortunate that there's a schismatic group called the Society of St. Pius X, which is not associated with him directly, but there's a reason they chose him. It's because he was the Pope who fought against modernism, and they believe that that's what they're doing now. So that's been cool to kind of see more deeply what he did and how that affects the church today. I've come to appreciate, the more traditional liturgy, seeing like some of the bad, I don't know if bad's the right word, but the abuses that have come out of Vatican II that essentially he was speaking of before it even happened, which is kind of interesting that he had that kind of knowledge, or that, foresight, I guess would be the better word. So there's him, and then kind of in recent years, I've been picking up, philosophy and whatnot. St. Thomas Aquinas obviously is, I don't know, he was a great scholar of the church, and even today you can read him and get something out of him, and he can answer so many questions that you wouldn't have even guessed were questions that were raised at the time that he was alive, which is really cool.
Since I've come into the church, I've been attracted to a lot of former Protestants, such as Dr. Peter Kreeft, Scott Hahn. There are a lot of big names that are circulating now, and it's really refreshing. I think this is part of Vatican II, the real spirit of Vatican II, the good stuff.
Right.
So what do you have to say about some of these popularizers of the Catholic faith that we find today, and how they counter some of the new atheism and some of the trends away from the church?
Well, so one who's not Catholic is William Lane Craig. I'm sure you're familiar with him. He was one guy that I listened to a lot to kind of understand how to tackle atheism, even though it wasn't a Catholic perspective. But I think if you're talking to an atheist, you shouldn't really even be focusing on the Catholic part. You should be working on just the belief in God at all. So he's one that comes to mind. I like a lot of the guys at Catholic Answers. Jimmy Akin is great. Tim Staples, Trent Horn, who's a younger guy. He's cool because he also does a lot of debates. He does a great job at kind of bringing a new perspective on the arguments for our generation, or even people who aren't part of his generation. But Matt Fradd, he started out doing a lot of work with pornography, and like he still does. He does a lot of talks to middle school and high school about the issue, but he started a podcast about 2 years ago now, which is Pints with Aquinas. So he's kind of delved more into his philosophy background at this point. I really love listening to him. He's just a great personality. Some others that come to mind is Brant Petrie, Dr. Brant Petrie. He has a few great books, and he's a Jewish scholar. He's a Catholic, but he is, I should say, an Old Testament scholar. So he brings a lot of context to a lot of things that we don't even really think about. When reading the Old Testament, a lot of times you just feel lost and don't know what's going on.
What about Pope Francis? What can you say about him, the good, the bad, the ugly, and what is the non-Catholic perspective on Francis from your experience?
Sure. Well, that's opening up a can of worms. So, starting with the good, I think he's pushed all of us to be more charitable in everything we do, to be more accepting of our neighbor. And I will say a lot of the things we see on, in the media are just flat out wrong. They're not factual quotes from Pope Francis, but there are even some quotes of Pope Francis that are real, and I would say the Pope didn't word that very well, where he probably wasn't speaking as carefully as he should have. And there are some things like, for example, there's one, and I'm pretty sure this is verifiably true, where Pope Francis said that the death penalty is contrary to the gospel, which in the history of the church has not been the case. It's never affirmed that the death penalty is intrinsically evil. Obviously, Pope John Paul II has spoken on how its use is no longer necessary in our society, and we may never have to use it again. But still, Pope Francis saying something like that, it's like, oh, he's changing the doctrine, or he's clarifying how we've been wrong about this all along. A lot of the times I'll see people who are not Catholic who are starting to be like, oh, this really makes me this Pope really makes me want to consider being Catholic, but it's almost all for the wrong reasons. I think there was some fake thing about cats and dogs go to heaven, says Pope Francis or something, and an atheist online posted this really makes me want to consider being Catholic again. It's like, I'm glad that you want to become Catholic again, but that's the worst reason to do that. So it's unfortunate. But overall, I think he's challenging us in more than one sense.
I am going to let you go, but I just want to touch briefly on this idea of the development of doctrine, because it is something that sprang to mind when you were talking about Pope Francis. How do things develop? Why was it only in the 4th century that the Trinity was formally defined? How did we get from Jesus Christ walking the earth to 4 centuries later, a bunch of men getting together and saying, hey, you know what? God's a Trinity. How do you talk people through that so that they don't think that we're just making this stuff up as we go along?
Yeah, well, I think one way I've heard it described is that things often don't become declared by the church until it's challenged. So, for example, the Trinity, it's very clear that the early church believed in that, even if it wasn't formally defined. And that's normally because some heretic group or Gnostic group would challenge it, and they had to clarify what they believed in order to fight that. The same is true, with the Protestant Reformation even. A lot of Protestants will say, the church didn't declare this until the Reformation. And it's like, yeah, because it wasn't challenged until the Reformation. We didn't need to declare it. It was known. So that's one way to look at it. Another thing is, with the development of doctrine, there's obviously a development of doctrine, but there's not a change in doctrine or a reversal in doctrine. So, for instance, with, say, the perpetual virginity of Mary, that was a doctrine that was developed over time and was formally declared at a certain point of time. But it wasn't, in doing that, it wasn't contradicting or undoing any previous doctrine, which is why you don't find a doctrine in the church that contradicts a previous doctrine or a current doctrine. Otherwise, it would be so easy to refute Catholicism. You would see every debate between a Catholic and a Protestant. You never see the Protestant bring up, oh, the church taught this, but now it teaches this. How is that possible? Because, that would end the debate, honestly.
At the end of my interviews, I always ask my guests to just talk directly to the audience and give a little message of hope, something cheery and bright. So what could you say to someone that might be out there listening now?
I truly do believe there is a revival in the church that is fairly new, that is happening right now, especially what I experienced in college. I would have never expected to find a community of several dozen college students who cared about the Catholic faith so much, because going in, I thought, I would be the only one here who really cared or was really trying, and then come to find, men who were pushing me to be a better person because they were already far ahead on, this issue, more in tune with their spiritual life, who were more disciplined with their prayer life. So I just see so much happening in the next few years. I can only hope for a revival in the church from the younger generation. So I would just say if there's anyone out there who feels like they're alone, you're not. I can't necessarily tell you how to find the other people who are like you, but all I can really say is that they are out there.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.